Welcome to this session for biology. In this webinar, we'll be covering the first two sections of chapter 24 in the biology textbook. This chapter is about flowering plants, and we're going to have a couple of review questions throughout it where I'll just pause and give you time to think about it and then go over the answers. So try to think of the answers and figure it out yourself before I give you the answers. And that's a good way to quiz yourself on how well you're understanding this. So to start, remember in chapter 22 that plants go through alternation of generations. There's a sporophyte phase and a gametophyte phase. Sporophytes are diploid, meaning they have two full sets of chromosomes. Gametophytes are haploid, meaning they only have one set of chromosomes. In some plants, like ferns, the phases are completely separate bodies where one grows and then it reproduces and then the other one grows. But in flowering plants, that's not how it works. In flowering plants, the main plant body is the sporophyte, and the gametophytes are tiny structures that grow inside of them. So this plant might have this flower and a stem and leaves and roots. All of that is the sporophyte phase of the plant. And then the gametophytes are just tiny little spots inside of it. These little red spots are the male and female gametophytes. The male gametophytes of the male gametes of a flower are the pollen. Pollen is produced by the anther, which grows on the tip of the stamen. Each pollen grain contains two haploid nuclei surrounded by a cell wall. So being haploid is important. All the gametes are always haploid. So remember, most organisms have two sets of chromosomes, and that's what the sporophyte phase has. But when the sex cells are made, which is what the gametes are, they're the eggs and sperm, the sex cells, they only have one set of chromosomes. They have half the number of chromosomes of the rest of the organism. And the idea is when the two of them come together, their chromosomes combine, and then they have two sets of chromosomes in the offspring. So those are the male parts of the plant. The female parts of the plant, okay, sorry about that. Those are the male parts of the plant. The anther produces the pollen, which are the gametes. The female part of the plant is called the carpel. The carpel, which is found in the center of the flower, produces and protects the female gametophytes. The gametophytes form inside of embryonic sacs in areas called ovules. The tip of the carpel is called the stigma. This is an area that collects pollen brought from other flowers. The pollen will then get down inside of the carpel and fertilize the ovules inside. Inside of an ovule that is ready to be fertilized is one haploid female gametophyte. When a haploid male gametophyte, which is pollen, fertilizes it, a diploid embryo is ready to grow. The ovaries that contain the ovules become fruit. The ovules become the seeds. So when you're eating a fruit, for example, an apple, the seeds inside of it is what used to be the ovules, and then the part that you eat is actually the ovary of the plant. Its job is to just protect those seeds, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the other jobs of fruit later. Flowers exist to help the male and female gametes come together in sexual reproduction, then to help protect the plant's developing seeds. The outer parts of the flower are the sepals and petals. Petals are the colorful parts, and sepals cover and protect the flower bud as it develops, and then they look like tiny leaves at the base of the flower when it blooms. Why do some plants make flowers that are so beautiful and colorful? Their purpose is to attract pollinators. Certain bees, some other insects, birds, bats notice the bright colors, and the flowers contain sweet nectar that the pollinators can eat. In return, by moving from flower to flower as they eat nectar, the pollinators get covered in pollen from the anthem of one flower, and then they rub against the stigma of another flower, beginning the process of fertilization. And here's a cool fact that's not in your textbook. We see a lot of pretty patterns on flowers, but many of the flowers actually have extra patterns that we can't see. Some plants have patterns that reflect UV light, ultraviolet light. It's a color that humans can't perceive at all, but bees can. So we may look at a flower and see plain white petals, but a bee looks at it and sees an area in the middle with a different color, guiding her to the pollen and nectar at the center of the flower. So some plants rely on pollinators, and so they have to make flowers to attract them. Other plants rely on the wind to blow their pollen from one place to another, so they don't bother making flowers. So pollen is, again, the male gamete, and it moves over to another flower and sticks to the stigma. And then what happens? How does fertilization actually happen? So the pollen grain lands on the stigma, and a pollen tube grows through the style. That's a hollow tube, and it goes down through the style into the ovary and enters the ovule. Then two haploid male sperm cells come through the pollen tube, and each fertilizes a single female nuclei inside of the ovule. One of these fertilization, oops, I'm sorry. All right, the two sperm cells come down, and each one fertilizes a female nuclei inside of the egg sac. This is called double fertilization because two fertilization events are happening in one ovule. One of these fertilization events produces the embryo, and the other produces the endosperm. So the embryo is the part that will turn into a new plant. So that's within a seed, it's part of the seed that's been fertilized, it's got two sets of chromosomes, it's ready to go. The other half is the endosperm. This was also fertilized, but it's not going to grow into a new plant. The endosperm's job is just to provide food, provide nourishment for the embryo. And before we go any farther, we're just going to do a quick review question. So which parts of the flower are female? So there's more than one answer. Some of these are male, some of these are female. I'll let you think about it for a few seconds and then show you the answers. Okay, so here's the results. Male is pollen. Okay, pollen is the male gamete. And the stamen is also male. And then you have the style, carpel, and stigma. Those are all female parts of the flower. Now, we've been talking this whole time about sexual reproduction, getting a male gamete and a female gamete together to make a new diploid embryo. But some plants can reproduce without sexual reproduction. A single plant produces offspring of itself that are genetically identical. It does this by basically just growing bigger and kind of breaking part of itself off. So the plant is reproducing by cell mitosis, just growing more cells of its own self, instead of creating gametes through meiosis. So it's not creating those sex cells, it's just using mitosis, making more plant, and then that bit of plant breaks off. This whole process is called vegetative propagation, and there's a couple different ways it could happen. Some, such as strawberry plants, send out long stems, and those stems put down roots and grow new plants. And that's basically what's happening here. You got this long piece that is growing over the wall here, and when it drops down, this will put roots into the ground and make a new plant. Some plants, like potatoes, grow buds that turn into entirely new plants, and some, like cactus, some species of cactus, drop little clones on the ground like this, and those can just grow into entirely new plants. Okay, so those are all versions of vegetative reproduction. And those all happen naturally, but it's also important to know that many of our crops, especially seedless fruits, are grown by artificial means of vegetative reproduction. We usually call vegetative propagation. Because humans develop some fruits to grow without seeds, they can't reproduce sexually. So, for example, wild bananas have lots of seeds in them. These bananas can drop to the ground, drop their seeds, new banana plants will grow. But these are cut in half, regular bananas from the grocery store, and they don't have any seeds. You plant it, nothing would grow. So those can't reproduce on their own. So other plants, these and other plants that humans grow that don't have seeds, they have to be grown by vegetative reproduction. They're either grown by cuttings, which is taking a budding stem off of a plant and getting it to grow its own roots, becoming a new plant, or grafting, which is taking a branch from one tree and splicing it onto another tree. The reason some plants use vegetative propagation is so they can reproduce quickly, they don't have to rely on pollinators, and they don't have to use the energy of producing flowers and seeds. But there is a problem with vegetative propagation, both natural occurring vegetative propagation and the artificial version. That problem is that all the plants are genetically identical. And that means there's no variety in them. None are stronger or weaker than others. None have special traits that might be helpful. So a single disease or single change in conditions can wipe out the whole population of that plant. And we have an example of that. The Gros Michel was a type of banana that was eaten all around the world until the 1950s, when a disease wiped them out. And because each banana everywhere in the world was identical, none of them had any traits that could help them fight the disease. If it could kill one banana plant, it could kill all of them. So the Gros Michel banana was wiped off, and now we eat a completely different type of banana that's also seedless. It's called the Cavendish banana, and they're all genetically identical clones. So it's actually possible that the same thing could happen again. A disease could come that affects banana plants and wipe out the whole population once again. So that's the end of section 1. So we have a review question here, and then we'll get into section 2. So what happens in vegetative reproduction? So there's more than one answer here that's correct. So consider which ones are part of vegetative reproduction and which ones are not. I'll give you a few seconds and then we'll go over them. Okay, so sexual reproduction, that is not part of vegetative reproduction. The whole point of vegetative reproduction is that it's not sexual. The plant just produces a clone of itself. It does not have to go through the male gamete meeting the female gamete. So I'll just cross that one out. Okay, that is not part of it. Okay. Flowers blooming, that's also not part of it. That's one of the benefits of vegetative reproduction. The plant doesn't have to make flowers to help this whole sexual reproduction thing happen. So there's no flowers. Mitosis is part of vegetative reproduction. So remember, the whole idea is the plant kind of grows part of itself bigger and breaks that part off and a new plant forms. So it grows that way by mitosis, just normal cell division, making it grow just like your body does as you grow from a child to an adult. Your body gets bigger by growing more cells by mitosis. If you cut yourself, you heal by mitosis. So that's the same thing that's happening here. So that means it's using mitosis, not meiosis. That is the process that makes the sex cells. It would make eggs and sperms. So with vegetative propagation, you don't need that. And our last one is true, genetically identical offspring are made. So in normal sexual reproduction, you have the male and the female, and they come together, and that means you've got a variety of genes now. You have genes from the mother, genes from the father. They're all mixed up. There's variation. But when you don't have sexual reproduction and the plant just kind of breaks off part of itself to become a new plant, it's going to be genetically identical for the first one. Okay, so at the beginning of the next section, we talk about fruits. So what is a fruit? The biological definition of fruit is a structure that surrounds and protects seeds. So to a biologist, foods like cucumbers, tomatoes, pumpkins, peanuts, and peas are considered fruits, as well as apples and grapes and other foods that we traditionally think of as fruit. So everything on the screen right now is actually technically considered a fruit. And what are they for? We already mentioned that fruits come from the ovaries of the plant that contains the seeds, but the fruits don't nourish the seeds. They don't provide it anything to help the seed grow. So what's the point of the plant making all of these yummy, brightly colored fruits? Their job is actually just to be delicious and get eaten. So what happens is when an animal eats the fruit, it eats the seeds inside of it as well, and then it walks away, and eventually it poops. And it drops the seeds on the ground inside of a pile of stinky fertilizer. So now the seed can grow into a new plant somewhere away from the shadow of the parent plant. Oh, there we go. So that's their whole job. The whole reason that plants have fruit is just so it could be eaten and the seed will be pooped out somewhere else. And not all flowering plants make fruit. Some have other ways for seed dispersal. They have seeds that are dispersed by the wind or water instead. And then the seed has to hit the ground at some point or another. And when it does, it may start growing right away, or it may remain dormant for a while, depending on the species. Dormancy means the embryo inside of the plant is still alive, but it's not growing. The seeds may remain dormant while waiting for a lot of water or a certain temperature or other environmental factors that would help the small plant grow. When it does begin to grow, the process is called germination. The seed grows by soaking up water swelling up until it breaks open, and then it grows roots that grow downward and a shoot that grows upward. And that's the end of this section. So quick review questions. What do fruits do? So I'll give you a few seconds to think about this one. There may be more than one correct answer. So do fruits attract pollinators, attract hungry animals, nourish the seed, or help disperse the seed? So here's our answers. Fruits don't need to attract pollinators because fruits don't form until after pollination. So remember, it's the flowers that attract the pollinators. Once the bees have come and pollinated the flower, it becomes fertilized. The flower kind of falls off, and the fruit is what grows then after fertilization. So they don't have to attract pollinators. The fruits happen later. Attract hungry animals, though, they do that. So remember, fruits are full of sugar, they're sweet, they're brightly colored. The idea is to attract an animal, to get it to eat it, and eat those seeds. Fruits do not nourish the seed. They do not provide it any help in that way. But they do help disperse the seeds. Again, attract hungry animals, the animals eat it, and then instead of just the seed dropping right on the ground directly under the bigger parent plant, the animal eats it and poops it out somewhere else. And then the plant can grow somewhere else. And we have one more review question here. Here are 4 different steps that are part of the reproduction of flowering plants. So in what order do these 4 steps happen? Let you think about it for a few seconds, then we'll go over it. Okay, and here's our answer. So the first step would be fertilization. So the pollen um, sticks on the plant, the pollen grains break open, the sperm cells go down and hook into the ovules and fertilize it. After that, the ovules become seeds and the ovaries become fruits. And then your seed gets dispersed somehow, and if there's dormancy, this is where it happens. So again, some of them sprout right away, some of them wait for the right conditions, they lay dormant. And then when I'm saying sprout, what I really mean is germination. That's the fancy word for it. So when the seed case breaks open and the little tiny plant comes growing out of it. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this section. In a couple of weeks, we're going to do the end of this chapter, section 3 and 4, so you can come to that. If you have any questions about anything we went over, here's how you would contact your instructor.